which tries to inculcate you certain knowledge through observation, through awareness, and building yourself much more stronger. The people were able to predict that particular disaster is going to happen few days or few weeks ahead. It's the non-formal means by which indigenous knowledge is disseminated provide a successful model for education in disaster management. Away from that and into the local villages of India, they are quite different in terms of the knowledge factor. Good morning and welcome to the session 5 of Unit 3 in Disaster Management. And this session is going to talk about the indigenous knowledge and the use of appropriate technology for the local resources. The title looks quite big and long, but then it has got a great presence and importance in terms of managing the disaster management. So let's go forward and try to understand what is the need for the indigenous knowledge system. Now first, let me try to understand and make you go through the factor that how the knowledge factor plays a very, very important role in disaster management. Now, development research tells us the success and the sustainability of interventions at community level depend upon the number of factors, availability of relevant local culture, knowledge, and the practices, the indigenous practice that combine new ideas to generate innovation. So that is why it is very, very important for all of us to understand and to take it forward. Now, this is highly important. This is highly needed in terms of understanding the factors. Now, we need to first understand about this factor called as the common knowledge or the local knowledge altogether. Why that is important, why that is mandatory for each one of us to understand here is that whenever we speak about the developmental aspect, whenever we speak about managing a disaster, managing a scenario or a situation, the most important thing that you need to develop over a period of time is called as your indigenous knowledge. So once you're able to make over that basic knowledge of how things are happening and how things are being made, then you will be able to support any kind of situation. And there's a very old saying in English, when in Rome, be like a Roman. What we mean by saying that is that you need to blend yourself to the local situation, to the local scenario as far as possible. And you cannot stay back as a stranger and try to help out on these situations. There are many cases in disaster management where you will be able to see that people have been able to bring in support or people have been able to handle the situation because they have the local knowledge about the situation. Now, for example, when the situation that happened in terms of the disaster in Uttarakhand, especially in Kedarnath and other areas altogether, the government of India did not have the first-hand knowledge about how to help people easily. But how did the government get its support? It's because of the local people, the tourists, the travelers, and the people who aid in terms of building up the tourism there. They knew what was the path. They knew what was the real problem that was happening in the Kedarnath at that point of time. So similarly, if you start understanding the local knowledge first, you will be able to combine the appropriate technology and you will be able to deliver what is needed. Now in China, the people always try to understand the local language, the community and the system very, very well. And that is one of the reasons why if you start seeing in China, the practice among the citizens in terms of their martial arts or in terms of their language or in terms of the culture is very, very strong rooted. The reason is that this helps to build in the indigenous knowledge, the inbuilt knowledge about the local system, the nature, the environment to a large extent as far as possible. Without that, we will not be able to tell you how things are moving forward and where it is moving forward. So that is why I always say that the need and the growth of the indigenous knowledge, the culture, the ideology about how system is working there. All those factors have to be understood very, very clearly. And then you can go ahead and approach people, tell them how to handle the situation. Also, in this context, I would like to mention about the factor called as the culture versus knowledge factor. Now, culture and knowledge have got two very, very important factors in terms of understanding a situation. Many of the societies in India are not that well built in terms of scripting the knowledge and making it as a document for a reading purpose, which means to say that there are communities in India which are following certain practices, certain ideology, or certain methods based on the ancestral knowledge that has been passed on to them. So they will not be able to go forward and handle a situation based on some documentation, based on some standard operating procedures. They are doing it because of an inherent knowledge that they have about the system, that they have about the local environment. They combine it with their experience and they just keep moving forward. Now, the difficulty that arrives here is that most of us do not spend time in learning about culture and applying that knowledge in terms of helping people. So history becomes a hindsight knowledge for us. We do not know about it exactly. We do not know about the practices thoroughly. So what happens is that in case of an emergency or an exigency coming forward, we do not know how to save people. We do not know how to go forward and tell people that how you need to come out of this particular situation. So that is where I would always say that the sustainability factors, the practices needs to be documented, needs to be told clearly to every single person so that they are able to help themselves and move forward. And the next thing is that I'm going to talk about indigenous knowledge itself, which refers to the methods and practice developed by a group of people from an advanced understanding of local environment. When I use that word advanced understanding, it's very, very important for us to first understand. Why do I say this? There are quite an amount of tribal people and communities that live in India which have developed the sixth sense or understanding by themselves. They have their own techniques, they have their own methods of making the environment understandable or accessible to them. They have not gone any formal education, they have not undergone any schoolings, or they've not gone to any university to develop a language. But what they have done is that they have tried to gel themselves as far as possible with the local environment and system. Now, for example, before the meteorological department started coming into picture and people started using the apps to predict the season and the climatic changes, these people knew it even much before. They were much more masters in terms of climatic prediction. Why was that possible? Is because they understood the factors of environment, they lived with it. The only thing is that they didn't come out and market their knowledge so that that would become a commercial factor. So indigenous knowledge is something that you start getting it inherently, possibly out of the group learning, a specialized learning group altogether, which tries to inculcate you certain knowledge through observation, through awareness, and building yourself much more stronger. So in a long run, you will be able to appreciate that this knowledge does not have a formal root. This knowledge does not have a formal source. This knowledge does not have a teacher. But this knowledge has got a lot of content which cannot be explained in mere words. So that is where the indigenous knowledge about a local environment becomes a very, very important factor, very, very interesting factor that tries to drive you across in different parameters. Now, if you start understanding about the habitation factor, also the generations of habitations that have been happening in India, all of them have been able to go through a particular cycle of knowledge which is quite precious for us to understand. And when you start from the Western Ghats, or when you go to the Himalayan regions, or you talk about the tribal people who live in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, or about Lakshadweep, or about any other places altogether, Now, all the people, all the villages, all the districts in India have a set of indigenous knowledge which is quite interesting to understand. They believe in it. So their belief gets converted into a knowledge in a long run altogether. Now, the common factor of making a belief transform into knowledge is even more complicated for us to understand. Why? Because we try to move away saying that that's a superstitious act. But then that is not superstitious, but that is the most important factor called as knowledge. Let me just give you a small example. Now, most of us have a common psychological factor saying that when a cat crosses the road, you need to stop the vehicle for a moment because that's not a good sign to continue traveling. Now, how far you may believe or you might not believe, it's up to you. But then the reality comes here is that the impart of knowledge might be from certain people who have experienced that kind of any bad omen or a signal when they have tried to cross a cat. So what is happening here is that the concept of belief versus knowledge always has a strong debate, and most of the time it is the belief that wins over knowledge. It is not just the knowledge that wins every time. And the belief gets converted into knowledge and it gets permanently rooted to that culture and to that system so that we are not able to go forward and decipher it in different angles or in different parameters. Now, when you come to the urban cities, you will be able to see that people do not believe in anything. That's the most fantastic part of the story. Now, if you go and tell people about something, they are not just going to believe you on the face value. You go and tell people in an urban city that today it's going to rain, or tomorrow there's going to be an earthquake, or day after tomorrow there's going to be a volcano. People are not going to believe you at all because they are not able to understand the root cause of this. Neither they want to know about it. The urban city, the lifestyle is more based on a methodical process, on a regular chain, on a monotonous living style, which does not have much of thinking, which does not have much of belief or an inherent knowledge that is being practiced altogether. It is just a chain that has been followed for years and for a generation. But when we move away from that and into the local villages of India, they are quite different in terms of the knowledge factor. They believe that it is not the regular methodology of learning. It is the awareness. You need to be aware of what you are doing. You need to be aware of the environment. And every time, nature will teach you something new. So when you happen to go with the tribals, the way they hunt, the way they gather food, the way they collect water, the way how they live in their huts or in their respective home, each of them has their own meaning. They have been built across with certain knowledge, with certain systems. So this kind of knowledge, this kind of cultural understanding is very much important when you are going to implement a disaster management plan that could educate people, that could tell them how you need to combine this indigenous knowledge and bring out a safety measure. Followed by this include originating with the community and a non-formal means of dissemination collectively owned, developed by several generations, subjected to adaptation and embedded in community's way of life, means of survival. Now, let me also throw a light on this particular statement talking about the survival factor and the embedding of knowledge into the system. If you happen to go to the coastal areas of India, fishing is the occupation, it's the lifestyle there. Now, how do the fishermen learn fishing? They were not people like you and me who went to a pond or to a river and carried a fishing rod and just stuck there for hours together waiting for the fish to come to the bait. They learned fishing by going to the middle of the sea. They learned fishing by understanding the coastal area signals and warnings, the depth of the water, and so many other factors. Now, this knowledge was not generated or transformed to every single citizen on this earth. Well, there are two reasons for it. One, we did not want to know it. Second, they did not want to come out of their shell and circulate the knowledge to this world. So what happens here is that, as exactly spoken, the non-formal way of learning started growing up to a very great extent among these people, and that remained very much within that society or within that particular area. They didn't want to go further and make this knowledge a public knowledge for everybody. They didn't just want to market it at any given point of time. So what happened is that knowledge itself turned out to become a method of survival, a method or a source of occupation from them through which they could probably go further and start living altogether. Now, fishing is one of the factors through which the entire fishermen lived their life, and that's how the entire concept of their survival goes forward. Similarly, when you talk about the people who live in the tribal areas, or who live through agriculture, or people who live through hunting or any other different methods in terms of their survival, have always kept the knowledge secret and possessive to themselves, and they have not gone ahead and released the knowledge anywhere. That's because their survival is based on the source of knowledge that they have gathered over the last few years. So in order to survive in a disaster, in an emergency situation, this knowledge has to be understood by the people living outside. Unless and until they are able to combine the local expertise with the knowledge, they will not be able to survive in any of this emergency situation. Moving forward, the relationship between the knowledge and disaster management. So do you need to have knowledge about disaster? The answer is yes. Why? Because the relationship between indigenous knowledge and the natural disasters has developed more interest in the recent years. The new discussion around the indigenous knowledge and the way how people have the potential to improve disaster risk reduction policies, integration systems have all bought into a lot of thought process. Now, way back a few years in Turkey, there was a disaster that took place. Now, not to mention what happened and how it happened, the people were able to predict that particular disaster is going to happen few days or few weeks ahead itself. Now, how did it happen? Did they have a vision? Did they have the sixth sense coming out all of a sudden? No, that was not. Why? Because these people had somewhere down the line, they had understood the factor called as the knowledge linking to disaster management. So they took some time, they combined their knowledge factor, and they came out very well understanding and sending those early signals or early warnings to the people. And thanks to them, why? Because they were able to save the life of millions of people in Turkey. Now, why that was important is that disaster is a one-time event, but it does not guarantee that it will not come again. It might become a recurring event. It might become a situation where you and me have to face that again and again. Earthquake does not just come once in a year. It might come multiple times in a year, or it might repeat once in 10 years also. But what is important is that when an earthquake happens, or when a flash flood comes into position, or a cyclone happens altogether, the learning out of that incident becomes even more important rather than the incident itself. So that is where I say the combination of knowledge with disaster. Every disaster leaves back a huge amount of knowledge which is potential enough to save you from the next disaster. But what people think, or what people analyze, assume, understand is that disaster is a negative effect which just washes away the life of people. So it's the end of the world. Definitely not, because let us understand that disaster will have an impact only to certain regions and certain areas. Disaster never comes like a global effect altogether, unless and until we had the recent pandemic, coronavirus coming in, where the entire world had got affected. But still, it doesn't mean that it went to the end of the world. There's always a survival from every disaster, because people will find ways to survive. So what is becoming very important here is that the knowledge factor that comes into picture. You need to understand the knowledge. You need to understand what the previous incident has taught us. Now, God forbidden, if there is going to be another virus breakout, which might happen in the next 2, 3 or 5 years, it is not going to happen. Let's pray God that it's not going to happen. But if there is going to be a breakout that's going to happen, people now definitely know how to protect themselves by using a face mask, by using a sanitizer, by maintaining social distance. So this is the knowledge that we have learned out of a pandemic. So similarly, every person in this world has to understand that the disaster management has got an inherent knowledge which you need to understand over a period of time. So every time when there is going to be an attack, when there is going to be a factor here, that means to say that there is some knowledge which is getting inbuilt there. So every terrorist attack, or every tsunami, or every cyclone, or every flash flood, or a volcano, or an earthquake that is going to come on this earth is going to leave back a treasure of knowledge which needs to be combined, which needs to be documented, so that in the next century, in the next era, that is not going to be repeated again, and we are trying to avert it as far as possible. Now, talking about the approaches, the first approach is that various practices of strategies are embedded in knowledge, which is quite known and which prove valuable against the natural disasters, can be transferred and adapted to other communities. So what I would like to say here is that this concept of transferring knowledge to our students, to our present generation, is very, very important. Why? Because even as you are studying this subject, please understand that the knowledge what you have acquired, or the knowledge what you have understood in terms of disaster management, needs to be transferred to every single community in India, so that they make use of this knowledge. They are able to go forward and change and bring about some sort of positivity in the society. It is not that you have to restrict, it is not that you have to ignore the knowledge. Rather, take the knowledge as a positive sense and start growing forward. The next one is that the incorporation of indigenous knowledge sense practices and policies in terms of encourages the participants in the affected community, empowers its member to take a leading role in all disaster risk reduction activity. Now, what is happening is that most of the time when you talk about the disaster risk reduction factor, what we are trying to do here is that you cannot stop a disaster completely, but you can try to take methods to reduce the risk factors. So you know that people who are staying in coastal area will again get affected by a cyclone or by a flash flood. So what you can do is that next time start removing people, moving them away from the coastal area to the internal parts of the city, only as a temporary arrangement, in order to prevent the disaster getting into a violent way. So similarly, most of the disasters can be averted, can be reduced in terms of velocity when you are able to combine the knowledge, when you are able to tell the people exactly how it needs to be changed, how it needs to be looked forward. The next factor is that the information that has been there in terms of shared and indigenous knowledge can be used for implementation in most of the project. That is very, very important here. Finally, the non-formal means by which indigenous knowledge is disseminated provides a successful model for education in disaster management. Now, most of us would have undergone an exercise called as a fire drill. Moment there is a fire alarm ringing in your company or in your house or in your society, it is expected that you start running out of the house and go to the nearby place as a standby point. Now, that is a drill, or that is an exercise that has been created so that you get accustomed in terms of whenever there is a fire breakout or anything happening, so that you know how to save yourself. So similarly, we need to bring educational models that can help us in solving and helping us out from the disaster management situations. With this, I come to the end of this session. I hope and believe that the session was highly informative, useful, and of a great resource to you. In the upcoming session, we are going to talk about the use of technology in terms of averting disaster management. But until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me on this wonderful session.